Hey, thanks for stopping by. Today we're going to talk about minimum and maximum power settings in Lightburn. Have you ever had your corners burn, or maybe an intricate line design and you just can't seem to get it where you don't have to do a lot of sanding? Well, today I'm going to show you how you can eliminate all those issues. It has less to do with your maximum power settings and more to do with your minimum power settings. And just small adjustments on your minimum power settings can have dramatic effects on what your work looks like. And I'll be able to demonstrate that for you today. So let's go ahead and check out what minimum and maximum power settings are all about when it comes to line work in your laser. Before we get started, we need to talk about the minimum threshold that your laser tube has before it fires. That's pretty critical in determining what settings you're going to start with today on your minimum power. It's real easy to do, and what it is as you reduce your power settings, at some point your laser tube is going to cease to function. For an example, my minimum power, or my minimum percentage of power for my Thunder Laser Nova 2460 watt is 10%. If I set either my maximum or my minimum power at 9%, my laser tube does not fire and nothing comes out, nothing happens, okay? Once I go to 10%, I start to get a faint laser line, and that's pretty much the threshold that you want to determine. The quickest way to do that is just go ahead and draw a square, set your minimum and your maximum power, let's say start at 15%, and go ahead and run it, and keep dropping that setting from 15 to 14 to 13 all the way down until all of a sudden your laser ceases to function. And at that point you've just determined your threshold. It'll get you in the ballpark. Most ranges will go from anywhere from 7% all the way up to 14%. You're probably going to be somewhere in that range. But determining that and knowing what that is pretty critical to the process that we're going to discuss today. So go ahead and try to determine that before you try some of these methods that we talk about today. So let's talk a little bit about the parameters that we used for this particular test so you can see the dramatic effects that minimum power settings has. This is just a simple 1.5-inch square. I've run all of these squares at 300 millimeters per second. The maximum power setting was 40%, and then what I changed was the minimum power setting. The maximum power stayed the same at 40%, but what I did is I changed the minimum power from 5% to 10% to 20%, 30 and 40%. One of the things that really helps you understand how minimum power works is when the laser goes to draw this square, it's going to come along this line and it's going to use the 40% max power. It's going to slow down, and as it comes around this corner, you notice with a 5% minimum power, I don't have any line here at all in the corner, and that's because this 5% is below the threshold of my laser tube, and so it basically turns it off. And then it starts to go with the 40%, goes along here and turns it off. So when you're doing line work with your laser, this is how critical minimum power is. If you set your minimum and your maximums the same when you're doing line work, you're going to see that you get some pretty cruddy results. And so in this particular case, because I'm below the threshold of my laser tube, it actually turns the laser off in the corners. You would almost think I've got tabs set, but that's not the case. It's just that I'm below the minimum 10%. In this particular case, I boosted it up to my threshold at 10%, and you see now that I have a very nice clean corner, no burns. None of this has been sanded or anything treated in any way. And you can see now I have a complete square. I don't have any missing parts, and that's because I've got my minimum threshold set. Once I go to 20%, you're going to see I'm going to start to get burning in these corners. And the reason being is because when the laser slows down to come around this corner, The minimum it's going to go down to is 20%. So when it comes down here, it's applying 20% power to this corner when it has to slow down and change direction. And it's more dramatic the higher minimums you get. So when you go to 30%, you'll notice that my burning gets a little bit more severe. And then when I go to 40%, you can see minimum and maximum powers are 40%. I've got a lot of burning in the corners. I've got a little bit of blowout in the corner. So when you actually sand this, you're still going to have a dark spot. It's not going to look nearly as clean as it should. So when you're doing line work with your laser, not necessarily engraving, but line work, and you're setting your minimum and your maximum powers the same, you're never going to get a quality cut. And that's where knowing where your threshold is on your laser and setting your minimum powers appropriately can really clean up your line work. This is just as dramatic when you go to the the perforation mode. This is a perforation mode setup, same settings, identical. And you can see now where this would be a beautiful perforation. I could go ahead and actually reduce my maximum if I wanted this to be lighter. And you could get it as light and as clean as you want. You don't have any burning in the corners in any way. So whether you're doing line work or perforation work, same thing applies. Your maximum and minimum settings are critical into the way it looks when it comes out of the laser. This you would have to do no sanding. This you're going to have to do quite a bit of cleaning up before that product's going to be acceptable to a customer. So those settings when it comes to line work and designs are really critical. So the next thing I'm going to show you is, okay, this is somewhat dramatic on just a regular square, but what effects do we have when we do some line work on an intricate design? And you're going to see that the effects are even more dramatic. So let's go ahead and take a look at those. Okay, so this is a pretty intricate piece of design for line work. And just so you understand the parameters, each one of these was set to 350 millimeters per second. They were all kept at a 16% maximum power setting. And then we go from 10%. So at 10%, that's my minimum on my threshold. You've got a fairly light design, absolutely no scorching whatsoever, but it's a little bit light, but it's very detailed. Compared to if I matched my minimum and my maximum, you can see that we've got a lot of scorching going on. You'd have to sand this before it would be acceptable. And because there's so much small movements, you know, you're just getting a lot of burning because your minimum and your maximum is set the same. Look at the dramatic difference between going from 10% over here at a minimum to 13% over here. You can see that this is a little bit light, not a whole lot of depth. This is way too much, and this is just about right. You got a lot of nice depth. There's very little, if any, sanding that has to happen. And the only difference was we went from 10% over here on your minimum power setting to 13% on your maximum power setting. With an intricate design like this, you could really jump up your maximum and it's not going to matter a whole lot. It's your minimum settings that are going to drive what this design looks like. And the reason being is because there's so many small movements that your laser is doing that it really never has a chance to go to the maximum setting. There's just not enough room here. This design is about 3.5–3.75 inches across. So it's not tiny, but it's not giant either. So this is a great way for you to see the dramatic effect of 3% in your minimum power settings and the way your product looks. This is not quite enough. This is way too much. And this is just about right. And matter of fact, if I wanted to, I could probably drop this down to 12% and get rid of this little bit of scorching that I have in these little bitty tiny holes. But anyway, it's just an example to show you that, man, pay more attention to your minimum power settings when you're doing intricate designs like this. It will make a huge difference in the look of your product, and probably just as importantly, you don't have nearly as much after your laser work to get it ready to go ahead and deliver to your customer. This, I've got a lot of work to do after the fact. This, I have very little. Those kind of things can make a huge difference in how much time it takes for you to produce a product. So 10%, 16%, 13%, again, I could play with this just a little bit more and get it in the sweet spot, and I would probably not have to do anything with this particular ornament. Take it off the laser, and that would be it. So pretty dramatic effects on minimums. I wanted to show you the effects on text in line work and your minimum power requirements and how it has effects on it. So they were all run the same millimeters per second, 300 millimeters per second. We started with a 40% max, 10% minimum here for both a larger and a smaller text. One of the things that you'll want to pay attention to is the smaller your design goes, the more important this minimum power setting influences what comes out. So right here, 40 and 10, pretty clean, but it's still not quite crisp. We need to make some adjustments. You can see I've gone from 10% minimum to 20% minimum. You can see now we're starting to get darker lines. We've got a little bit of smoke damage going on here. And then once we go to the smaller text, you can really see that we've got a lot of scorching going on. You may or may not be able to save this, but this is probably not going to be acceptable, right? So even though it was okay for this bigger text, it's not going to be okay for the smaller text. So keep that in mind when you're doing your design. If you've got mixed sizes, in some cases what you might want to do is put this on one layer and this on a separate layer so you can adjust your minimum power settings so they turn out well for both sizes. Then over here we've got the 40 and 40, and you can see that it didn't matter much on the larger text because the laser can travel this path at a pretty good speed, and so it doesn't need to slow down much. Therefore, it's not using the minimum power setting as much, and that's why you don't see a whole lot of difference between this at 20% minimum versus this at 40% minimum. It's because the laser is going fast enough, it's not necessarily using the minimum power setting. And so you can see, and there's really not a whole lot of difference here, but it's still not acceptable. It's still pretty scorched. So then what I wanted to do is see if I could clean up this text with some minor adjustments. So down here, I reduced my percentage down to 17% maximum. I increased my minimum to 12%. So 17 max, 12%. You can see now I'm going to start getting some darker lines, which you didn't see up here, and that's because I went from 10 to 12. Still getting some scorching down here in the smaller text. And so what I did is I left my maximum alone at 17%. I reduced my minimum from 12% to 11%. And then the only other thing I did is I turned, instead of my airflow being off, I turned my max air on. And so a lot of times you can do that. And you can see in this particular case, this right here is, you know, for both the larger and the smaller is very clean. You wouldn't have to do hardly any sanding at all. There's no smoke damage. So pretty clean. So as you can see, just by playing with the minimum and maximum settings when it comes to line work with your laser, makes a huge difference.
Well, I don't know about you, but once you figure out what those minimum power settings need to be, you'll have a whole lot less work to do after you pull your work off your laser. As you can see, it's not hard to figure out once you understand the difference between minimum and maximum and what a dramatic effect your minimum power settings when you're doing line work on your laser. Play with that a little bit, and I think you're going to find that it's going to make a huge difference in your output. As always, I really would appreciate it if you would like and subscribe. Until next time, thanks and have a great day.